Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon, for that bit of research. And I mean, just on the point of services, I think it's a real fillip in the hat of the Caribbean Network of Service Coalitions that the TTMA would point to the network as an example of something that's going well. And now that network is chaired by Ms. Marjorie Straw from the Jamaica Coalition of Services Industries. So I think we've had some movement, and that there are a lot of benefits that can be derived therefrom, and government should take that into consideration as their national coalitions grow and develop. It's now time for Ambassador Gayle Mattern, who leads the region's negotiating agenda, and she's going to talk about what's happening globally and how it impacts us right here in the region. Ambassador Mattern.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ministers, colleagues, and friends. As I see many faces I have worked with over the years here today, and I'm very, very pleased to be here and very pleased to see the turnout. I would also like to express great appreciation to the organizers of this colloquium, which I think is extremely timely and relevant given what has been happening with our export trade performance in the region in recent years. And it is clear that we need to bring our best minds together in order to look at what we can do going forward. I want to spend a little time just situating the region in the international global trade negotiating agenda activities, and then look at a few things that CARICOM or the Caribbean may wish to look at going forward. The last 2 decades, of course, have seen major changes in the trade negotiating environment, beginning, of course, with the completion of the Uruguay Round and the emergence of the World Trade Organization in 1995, establishing multilateral trade rules, binding on all members, including those of us in the Caribbean. These rules, and in particular those related to the dispute settlement understanding, and we've had many references to that today, and I'm sure yesterday, led to challenges to the preferential arrangements which then governed the Caribbean's major agricultural exports, and the binding rulings of the DSU led in some way to the dismantling of those preferential arrangements. We heard how one company responded to that, severely affecting many of the economies in the region. Before we in the Caribbean had time to absorb the implications of the Uruguay Round agreements, a decision was taken in 2001 to launch a new round of global trade negotiations. We supported that launch somewhat reluctantly, but I think that we hoped that it would provide an opportunity to recalibrate some of the multilateral trading rules to take more fully into account the real differences in economic development and capacity among WTO members. Unfortunately, 12 years later, the Doha negotiations have yet to lead to new agreements, and that recalibration which many developing countries hope for, especially members of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group, has not yet happened. Doha is on ice despite efforts to try and get an early harvest package at the end of this year. At the same time, though, in what is a really clear expression of countries' desire to continue liberalizing their economies on the basis of predictable access and rules, we have seen a remarkable proliferation of bilateral or plurilateral reciprocal trade agreements. In 1990, for example, there were 70 functioning agreements. Today, there are over 300. All WTO members, including those in the Caribbean, have joined or are negotiating at least one reciprocal trade agreement. Of course, while most of them are regional, in the sense that the parties to an agreement are from the same region, for example, our CARICOM arrangements or the NAFTA arrangements. An increasing number are cross-regional, for example, Costa Rica and China, and of course our own economic partnership agreement with the European Union. One reason which has been put forward for this large increase in preferential trade agreements is the fact that negotiations, of course, at the WTO level haven't yielded any results since the end of the Uruguay round. And you may wish to note that there are many analysts who are critical of the proliferation of these agreements, arguing that they increase the cost of doing business due to complicated and overlapping rules of origin in particular. They can facilitate protectionism. They can produce ways of discrimination and exclusion, and in fact undermine the multilateral trading system itself. Nevertheless, we should recall that these types of agreements are permitted under WTO rules. Some of the reasons which appear to motivate countries to negotiate these type of agreements include opportunities to increase trade between or among the parties, although the analyses that have looked at increases in trade have focused mainly on trade in goods. Unfortunately, the data sets regarding trade in services, particularly in this part of the world, are not totally adequate. Other reasons include surety in securing access to supply chains and vertical production arrangements, economies of scale issues. That was one which I think influenced some of the provisions which we put in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Another reason could be a buffer against preference erosion. Certainly that was one of the issues that influenced our decision to negotiate an economic partnership agreement with Europe. And of course, the issue of predictability of trade policy issues such as rules of origin, etc. There are, of course, also wider political and economic considerations. These may include security and strategic issues, the erosion of multilateralism, which we unfortunately are seeing in many areas today, investment stability, the results of domestic lobbying, and the reality of power relationships. What we are also seeing today is an increasing number of preferential trade agreements involving developed and developing countries, and again, the EPA is one such example. And of course, many of these agreements have moved beyond harmonizing border measures such as tariffs and customs procedures, and now seek to integrate a number of domestic policies and regulations. These include diverse issues such as product standards, competition policies, investment rules, government procurement, intellectual property rights. The negotiation of what has been described as deep integration agreements has been increasing precisely because the harmonization of certain regulations are a prerequisite for trade in specific sectors, such as services, or because a common competition policy is needed for comparative advantage to materialize the benefits of an agreement. So it's generally accepted that the complexity of the 21st century trading environment, among other things, owes much to the increased role of the international production networks, the unbundling of production stages, and the outsourcing of services across borders. Increased international competition means that for cross-border production networks to operate smoothly, a number of national policies need to be harmonized across jurisdictions. The provisions of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas is an example which envisaged, or it was an instrument which envisaged that type of harmonization. Negotiating market access alone is therefore no longer sufficient to address possible distortions of unilateral policy making, and to the extent that the multilateral trading system is perceived to deal with traditional trade policy issues, i.e. market access openings, countries are clearly seeking other ways, such as these deep integration agreements, in which to address their coordination challenges as they relate to trade. In this region, as has been pointed out, I think, in the course of today's discussions and yesterday's, CARICOM, of course, has negotiated a number of trade agreements with its neighbors, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Costa Rica, And Sheldon just showed us our performance under those agreements. These agreements focus mainly on market access for goods, and I would like to suggest that perhaps the time has come to look at what we can do in relation to trade and services in partnership with these countries with whom we already have agreements in our region. Of course, a trade and services component is envisaged in the context of our agreement with the Dominican Republic, both in the existing FTA as well as in the regional preference provision of the EPA. We are also including trade and services as a major part of our negotiations with Canada. But at the same time, I suggest that we may need to look more closely at securing agreements with non-traditional partners, both with some of the major growing economies in the wider region and the hemisphere, and Sheldon touched on that. And in this context, it is worth noting that some CARICOM member states have recently concluded or are negotiating partial scope agreements with countries in Central and South America. Earlier this morning, an excellent proposal was made that we should be looking at strengthening our trading relationships with the non-independent members, countries in our own region. And I also suggest that we should be looking at ways in which we can strengthen secure agreements with non-state actors on the trade front. And an example that I'd like to throw out, and which may be worth pursuing, given our region's growing interest in health tourism, for example, relates to exploring the possibility of standalone agreements with health insurance providers in North America designed to promote health insurance portability. Another example, although I know that our moderator didn't seem to place much importance on them, is the need to look at negotiating standalone mutual recognition agreements with professional groupings. I'm linking this to my health tourism proposal, such as healthcare providers in source markets. This, of course, has the advantage of providing potential consumers of our health tourism the assurance about the quality of healthcare which may come to our region when they come to our region. Another dimension in which the trade negotiating arena, which CARICOM has placed great emphasis on, is the development dimension, recognizing that, of course, there are major disparities, economic disparities between developed and developing countries, which are thrown up very starkly in the context of trade negotiations between those two groups of countries. And so we have argued for the development dimension to be reflected both in the way the various disciplines are applied, asymmetrical openings of markets, for example, and in terms of the provision of support for capacity building and adjusting to greater liberalization. And I believe that a lot of the work that Caribbean Export is doing with member states reflects the outcome of that kind of support that we're receiving, particularly from our European partners. This approach, as I just indicated, is one that we took in the EPA. We're certainly taking it in Canada. And I just want to throw out that despite the difficulties that we may be having in getting these issues across and captured in negotiations, we are following a very, very interesting negotiation at the moment. And I'm speaking of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which involve both developing and developed countries. Very quickly, the countries involved are Chile, Singapore, New Zealand, Brunei, Australia, Malaysia, Peru, the United States, Vietnam, and just recently they were joined by Mexico and Canada. The TPP can be described as a deep integration agreement, but some of the elements which are being negotiated, and this is of particular interest given the composition of countries, include a focus on broad development-related issues, designed to assist all countries to implement effectively and realize the benefits of the eventual agreement. That is very familiar language to us in CARICOM. And another focus of these negotiations is to try and address the issues and challenges for small and medium-sized enterprises. We, of course, want to see the results of those negotiations and look at them. But in closing, colleagues, I want to suggest that the real elephant in the room in the process of designing an effective export strategy is what we do domestically and what we do within the region. And of course, I will not go into detail here. I know I have heard many of my colleagues who spoke earlier identifying very specific actions in that area, and I'm sure those who will speak after me will continue to make recommendations. But until we address the issue of strengthening our production base within the region, then we will not be able to take advantage of any access that we have in external markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mattern, for that, and in particular for the last point. Just to make it clear, we do consider the MRA as a very important process, and the negotiation thereof, we're working with Caribbean Export, the coalitions, and the institutes of architects around the region on architects, in particular in the short term. As we speak about the productive base, you know, we look at markets externally, but if you look at sectors such as education and health tourism, if we expand them here, we immediately create a market for also our products locally. So if we have, and that is something that each island or each country can focus on without affecting the other. So we have St. George's in Grenada, we have schools in St. Lucia and St. Kitts, and everybody could have foreign universities. Everybody could have health tourism services and still not be able to satisfy the market and negatively impact one another. Our next speaker is Mr. Jimmy Moss Solomon. I don't know how he's going to top his presentation from about an hour ago, but having heard him speak in various fora, I'm sure that he'll find a way. I introduce Jimmy Moss Solomon.
So, moderator, thank you very much. I'm back to bat again, which means, in my observation of logics, that the bowlers have been doing their job and the other team is out. So I'm back again to bat in the second innings of the test match. The other thing is that with international trade, you have to be positive. Timing is important. Let me say, timing is very important in international business. Ambassador Mattern and I are friends for a long time, but timing was not my favor. We grew up less than 100 yards or gates from one another as children. And if I could run like Usain Bolt, one of us would have to change our name because our mother or grandfather wouldn't have seen me coming up the road at 9.58. So timing is important in everything, even in matters of romance. No, now that you're awake. Now that everybody is paying attention, we need a growth agenda. This is exactly what we're talking about. This is the purpose of the forum. It says the forum speaks to export-led growth, but it's really about growth. Growth doesn't have to be a traditional thing about exports or traditional exports. The concepts of international trade have gone beyond moving goods and services from this place to another, and we have different methods of satisfying. The parameters of this is that we fall into the fact that international trade is no longer negotiable. It's happening. It's happening. We can't delay it. We may do some things in the interim to try and refine it, but it's something that's happening. It happened before. I won't bother going into the history of that, but it has happened before. Got decimated in ancient days and is back around. It goes beyond the parameters of primary agriculture, which used to be our forte for 300 years and more in this Caribbean area under the system of colonialism, slavery, etc., and all that before. The parameters surpass most value-added agriculture and it even surpasses processed products because simply we have a supply constraint in small countries which do not allow us to satisfy the demands of international markets. There's a limitation to exactly how much coffee we can actually grow in Jamaica, because the Blue Mountain region, which is pulling the highest value of coffee perhaps on the world market, has a limited space, even though to those of us in smaller countries who come from smaller countries, the Blue Mountains may seem vast, but in a worldwide environment, it's not vast. Fresh is in the world in terms of produce, but fresh needs discipline because we can't access markets willy-nilly as we used to, and it needs rapid transportation. And the last point on that is that our produce is generally not unique. I went to Thailand 1981. I went to the market in Thailand and I have everything and more than we had in our market in Jamaica, including an abundant supply of a fruit we call stinking toe, which many Jamaicans haven't seen for years or probably don't even know what it is. Patterns are changing. Global trade routes are changing rapidly. In fact, the whole transportation of goods and people are happening in a different way. We no longer are confined to the traditional ways, and people are moving. Flights are longer. Flights are going non-stop to places that used to take, you know, my father was born in 1896, so a trip to China. He might not have been back yet. Well, that nearly happened to Marco Polo. And he went by land. But I don't know. These things happen, and it's happening in a short period of time. Our manufactured goods are shifting to China and Southeast Asia. The sources of them, the movement of them, they are coming rapidly from there. They're establishing new trade routes. Services that are now services you provide from in your home. We spoke about that in Ghana yesterday and the limitations that were imposed. But Ghana is there ready. When they're ready to go, they'll be making cartoons there and earning a lot of money from doing that in Ghana. Generally, though, we must accept that we are not necessarily the inventors or innovators. We do some very good services, but we didn't invent hotels. We didn't invent tourism. We didn't invent ships. We didn't invent airplanes. We're using them quite well. And what we must do is be realistic in how we look at that. I spoke on the first innings about the 4 stages of growth. We need to understand it because the basic foundation of global trade is the corporation. The sole proprietor has very little place in a global environment unless that person is the originator or inventor of something which is copyrightable or patentable. Let's get that through our heads. Global trade is not Miss Matty, who is at the school gate, is now going to sell goods to Brooklyn. That's not on. So let us get it through it, because it's a mindset that we have in the Caribbean that everybody wants to own everything. We don't, you laugh at people like me because Grace Kennedy don't buy me a boat. Like how you in a small business buy a boat for your sister who is living there and send your other worthless brother on a holiday to the south of France. It can't be done in a public company. Let's just be realistic, but it is a public company and a larger company that is able to enter international trade. So let us be perfectly honest with ourselves in that we need to move through a developmental status. I say developmental because the governments need to understand it, to encourage it, that encouraging businesses to grow through the various stages is an important aspect of growing their own economy. The caution I have in this is that each stage of development requires different capital structures involving widening of ownership and the use of equity capital. We cannot be talking here today about donor money to expand our businesses. I teach fourth form students in the inner city principles of business for CXC. The fundamental thing is that what is the reason for being in business is to make a profit. That's the fundamental reason all of us are here. We don't go into business to be philanthropists. We give philanthropy out of the profits that we make in the business. We don't set out to make a loss. And the stage 4 CARICOM to the world is vastly beyond our individual capabilities, even at the larger companies in our region. And it necessitates a concept of mergers, joint ventures, and acquisitions if necessary. But it certainly means working together to go to places that we haven't been to before. The private sector drives the 4 steps, as we understood, but the explanation needs government support in the message. Governments cannot be continuing to preach that the ways of employment of the old way are going to get our citizens out of the trap of poverty. So more cane cutters is not the answer in a global environment and in 2013. It is not. It may be popular to say it on the political platform if you happen to have a constituency that has sugar lands there and maybe might win you a few votes and hopefully win you the election. But the question is that on a country basis, the jobs, the opportunities that exist in a global environment are vastly different from a man and a machete. And in the case of us, in some parts of the world, perhaps a spliff too. So the policy of a government, and the government is not responsible for growth. We business people are responsible for growth, but the government needs to support us by encouraging a policy that brings understanding through our representation in government, in parliaments, in people who represent constituents, explaining the concept to them and making it easier for us to go down the road of growth. So the policy must support the growth agenda. Therefore, we talk about the Caribbean Business Council or something like that is very, very necessary. Former Prime Minister Arthur saw it, former Prime Minister Manning saw it, former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson saw it. I saw it as a former president, but it looks like the message is only informers. Right? Informer is not a nice word in Jamaica, by the way. But all of us are former, and therefore the knowledge or the vision that was there shared does not seem to have been passed on to the current leadership, and it is lost in the translation. Therefore, there's no doubt in my mind that this is part of what stagnates our respective economies over the last many, many years. Finally, levels 3 and 4. The concept of country of origin is no longer relevant. It is replaced by the building of brands. No, it sounds as if I'm preaching anarchy, but I'm not. Have you ever wondered with the products that used to formerly get regularly on this, before we started producing for ourselves, Del Monte fruit cocktail. Everybody here know Del Monte fruit cocktail? Do you think that the place that grow the grapes and the pears is the same place that grow the pineapple? Or do you think they come from different parts of the world? So why are we trying to replicate a development program which suggests that we, in order to produce fruit cocktail, we must be able to grow grapes in Barbados? It somehow does not make sense to me. But at the world trade level, we need to access markets and we need to access them from where we can be competitive. Competitive is not always at home in the type of services or goods that you want to provide. But this is why the dialogue needs to be now and to be current. You can't say, whoa. Let me use myself as an example. Everybody attacks and says, boy, Grace selling coconut water, and it come from Thailand. Well, maybe a mistake we made is to sell some of it in Jamaica, but if you knew the quantity that we sold worldwide, we would have to dig up the whole of Jamaica and the minister's house and my house and everything and plant coconut, and we're going to have to live under a coconut tree in order to produce that much coconut water to satisfy where we are selling now, and yet we are not even near our potential. But the brand on that thing is important. This is where I talk about branding. Branding is important to the company that is involved in international trade. It's not just commodity based like we used to think about it. World famous brands. I don't know, apart from where they may report the taxes or whatever, I don't know where Unilever is, because they're in 160 countries, and so is Procter & Gamble. And so that's the lead. That's the direction of growth that we need in the Caribbean to think about. I know it sounds bad for our political representatives to hear that, we're going to actually expand beyond the shores of these little countries that we found ourselves trapped in. But that is the growth. That is what will be good for our country. That's what will be good for the people. And so, please, don't leave here with the idea that producing things around the world to satisfy global markets is anything wrong. Banks Beer cannot ship water from Barbados to Australia. Someday they are going to have to open a plant. If they have an acceptable product, desirable product in their beer, and Australians want to drink it, and there's how many million Australians that want to drink it, banks going to have to consider how they finance a brewing operation or manufacturing operation of some type in Australia. Last thing I leave you with. Having been responsible for Grace Kennedy strategic planning over a number of years, and still do a little bit of it, I look at trade agreements that don't necessarily affect us. They're not CARICOM bound. I look and see whether or not I have a trade agreement. Right now, I can tell you, I'm looking to see what trade agreement New Zealand and Australia have with the Seychelles Islands and other parts of Southeast Asia, which we're not even thinking of. But I have to think that one day I want to be there. So it makes a choice, gives me a choice. Where do if I want to access the Indian market, who has a favorable agreement with India that I can make some products there? Does that make me a traitor? No. I'm a businessman. And I think all of us need to think about these things. I don't just watch where I'm not forcing Ambassador Mattern to try and ask for having 200 staff in order to negotiate an agreement with every place in the world, because I know I can't ship to every place in the world from Jamaica. But I know with what is happening now in our current dialogue that there are millions of containers waiting to be shipped to Jamaica, to be shipped to other places in the world. And that's our latest plan. I won't preempt our minister on that, but that's what we are working on. That is truly a global concept. This is not a hub to just ship sugarcane to Britain. This is a worldwide and global hub of logistics, which makes us leap from 1865 to the new millennium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moss Solomon. Very practical, straightforward. And similarly, we should be, as someone said yesterday, we should be using our trade agreements to attract people who want to enter the markets with which we have agreements.